Hey guys, tonight we begin with monuments, the greatest creations of the ancient world, built to defy time and, as it turns out, completely fail at it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before there were YouTubers ranking top 10 cursed artifacts, there were Greeks ranking buildings. Somewhere around the 2nd century BCE, a few educated men decided that life needed a list, not of virtues, not of heroes, but of really big, really expensive structures. It started as travel writing, the ancient equivalent of, "Here are 7 places you'll never afford to visit." The 7 wonders of the world quickly became civilization's first clickbait headline: grand, impressive, and doomed. The writers, mostly Greek tourists with too much time and too little sunscreen, included the Great Pyramid of Giza, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the statue of Zeus at Olympia, the Temple of Artemis, the Mausoleum at Halicarnassus, the Colossus of Rhodes, and the Lighthouse of Alexandria. 7 dazzling monuments built to last forever, and yet somehow not one of them came with earthquake insurance. Of course, the Greeks made the list mostly about themselves. 6 out of 7 were conveniently located within sailing distance of their favourite taverns. Babylon made the cut because it sounded exotic and probably had better marketing. The Chinese were building entire walls you could see from space, but since no Greek scholar wanted to walk that far, it didn't make the list. The wonders weren't chosen for their utility either. No one looked at the Lighthouse of Alexandria and thought, "Ah yes, this will solve traffic." They were built for the same reason humans build anything huge: pride, politics, and the deep primal urge to make future generations say, "Why?" And time, ever patient, got its revenge. 6 of the 7 were destroyed by fire, war, or natural disasters. The 7th, the Great Pyramid, only survived because it's too heavy to move and too dry to rot. So the 7 wonders became more than monuments. They became an inside joke shared by history itself. A reminder that no matter how grand our creations, nature and negligence will always hit delete eventually. It's comforting in a way. Everything humanity builds eventually crumbles, except bad ideas. Those last forever. If the 7 wonders were a classroom, the Great Pyramid of Giza would be that one student who ruins the grading curve. Built around 2560 BCE, it's the oldest of the wonders, and the only one that still exists, which is both inspiring and deeply suspicious. The pyramid was commissioned by Pharaoh Khufu, a man so obsessed with being remembered that he built a structure visible from space, a level of commitment modern influencers can only dream of. It's 480 feet tall, made of 2.3 million limestone blocks, and weighs about 6 million tons. Because apparently, moderation wasn't part of the Egyptian vocabulary. People like to say aliens built it, which tells you everything about how little credit we give ancient labourers. In reality, it was thousands of skilled workers, not slaves, who hauled, cut and stacked stones for decades. They were paid in beer and bread, making the Great Pyramid the world's first workplace pizza party. Originally, it was covered in gleaming white limestone that reflected the desert sun like a mirror, so bright that travellers could see it from miles away and immediately develop heat stroke. Then, over the centuries, earthquakes knocked the outer casing loose, and opportunistic locals stole the stones to build Cairo. So the pyramid went from blinding cosmic beacon to Instagram ruin in record time. Inside, things get stranger. Narrow corridors, booby-trapped shafts, and a coffin that was too big to fit through the doorway, meaning they built the entire structure around it. That's not architecture. That's a cry for help. Yet somehow, through floods, invaders, and endless sandstorms, it survived. The Hanging Gardens vanished, the Temple of Artemis burned, the Colossus of Rhodes face-planted into the harbour, but Khufu's limestone ego project still stands. Maybe the secret wasn't engineering, Maybe it's just that Egypt is really dry, and no one's figured out how to move 6 million tons without a forklift. Today, tourists still stare up at it in awe, whispering, "How did they build this?" The answer is simple: unhealthy ambition, cheap labour, and no HR department. The Great Pyramid remains the last wonder standing, proof that in the battle between man, time and gravity, you can win, but you'll need 100,000 employees and a terrifying god complex. The Great Pyramid wasn't built. It was willed into existence by a civilization that looked at solid stone and said, "Yeah, we can stack that." There were no cranes, no blueprints, no OSHA regulations, just ambition, beer, and a truly concerning disregard for spinal health. For centuries, people have argued about how it was built. Some say ramps, some say pulleys, some, bless them, say aliens. Because clearly, the only explanation for ancient Egyptians achieving something impressive is extraterrestrial intervention. Modern humans can't accept that someone with zero Wi-Fi built something straighter than our highways. The truth is, less magical and more miserable. Archaeological evidence shows that tens of thousands of workers, not slaves but paid labourers, spent decades carving limestone blocks and hauling them across the desert. Their payment? Bread, beer, and dental problems. Imagine spending 30 years dragging rocks through the sun just to die in your 20s. Ancient Egypt really was the original startup culture. These workers lived in massive camps near the construction site. They had bakeries, breweries, and even makeshift hospitals, proving that the Egyptians took team benefits seriously. Each block weighed between 2 and 15 tons, the equivalent of moving an entire elephant by hand. Thousands of years later, we still can't agree on how they did it, but we're certain it involved pain, yelling, and at least one guy named Thoth-Hotep saying, "I told you that angle was wrong." The pyramid rose over decades. Perfect geometry from people who had never seen a ruler made of plastic. When it was finished, it aligned almost perfectly with true north. Modern buildings can't manage that with laser tools. The Egyptians did it with stars, ropes, and an unholy amount of free time. When Khufu finally died, he was buried inside the structure that consumed half a generation's worth of labour. It worked. He's still famous. But it also set a dangerous precedent. Every pharaoh after him wanted their own pyramid, turning Egypt into the world's most depressing real estate race. And so, humanity's greatest engineering marvel began as all great ideas do. One man's ego, a workforce on carbs and alcohol, and zero plans for long-term maintenance. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon are the ancient world's biggest mystery, and possibly its biggest scam. Supposedly built by King Nebuchadnezzar II around 600 BCE, these gardens were described as a lush, tiered paradise. Exotic flowers, fruit trees, waterfalls, and shade in the middle of the desert. In short, it was a royal apology gift. The story goes that Nebuchadnezzar's wife, Amytis, missed the green hills of her homeland, so he built her an artificial mountain covered in plants. Nothing says love like 75-foot irrigation systems and a water bill that could bankrupt a kingdom. Ancient writers gushed about it. They called it a green wonder of engineering, a living miracle. But here's the problem. No one can find it. Not a single stone, column, or crumb of evidence. Archaeologists have scoured Babylon for centuries and found dust. It's like the ancient world's version of Atlantis. Majestic, inspiring, and suspiciously undocumented. Some historians think it wasn't in Babylon at all, but in Nineveh, built by the Assyrian king Sennacherib, who also had a thing for irrigation and showing off. Others think the Greeks just made it up entirely because they couldn't handle the idea of Mesopotamians outdoing their architecture. Either way, the Hanging Gardens might have been the first case of history writing its own fan fiction. Let's be honest. The descriptions sound almost too good. Terraces hanging in the air, fountains running on some mysterious mechanical system, vines curling through the mist. Either ancient Mesopotamia invented hydroengineering 2,000 years too early, or someone was heavily embellishing for dramatic effect. If the gardens did exist, They were probably destroyed by earthquakes, wars, or sheer disbelief. Mud brick and constant watering, a genius combination for structural failure. Imagine trying to keep a skyscraper alive in a sandstorm. The ancient world called it a wonder. Modern engineers would call it a hazard. So, did the Hanging Gardens ever exist? Maybe. Maybe not. But the story endured, which says something about humanity. We'll always prefer a beautiful lie to a boring truth. The Hanging Gardens remind us that sometimes the greatest wonder of all is how good we are at faking one. So, after centuries of historians swooning over the Hanging Gardens, a tiny issue popped up. No one could actually find them. Babylon, for all its historical importance, turned out to be oddly short on lush terraces and palm-covered ruins. In fact, archaeologists found exactly 0 evidence that such a thing ever existed. No stone foundations, no irrigation systems, not even a "Welcome to the Gardens" sign. This left scholars with 2 options. Either the ancient world's greatest engineering marvel vanished without a trace, or someone made it up. Enter the plot twist. Some historians now believe the famous gardens weren't in Babylon at all, but in Nineveh, 300 miles away. That's right. We might have been praising the wrong city for 2,600 years. It's the ancient equivalent of giving the Eiffel Tower credit to Belgium. The theory comes from Assyrian records describing a palace with massive gardens, flowing water, and even an early irrigation system powered by screw pumps, the same ones the Greeks later credited to Archimedes. Translation: Nineveh may have invented water pressure and never got the patent. If true, it means the Greeks simply misheard the story and mixed up 2 entirely different empires. It wouldn't be the first time they exaggerated. These are the same people who thought Cyclopes existed, and that Zeus personally handled the weather. Still, the mistake stuck because the Hanging Gardens of Nineveh just doesn't roll off the tongue. The Nineveh theory also ruins the romance. Babylon, hot, dusty, and doomed, was the perfect setting for a tragic love story. Nineveh was more of a military-industrial complex. So naturally, everyone preferred the version with flowers, not factories. It's a reminder that history is just gossip that survived long enough to get published. Maybe there were no hanging gardens at all, just one Mesopotamian gardener bragging to the wrong Greek traveller. Yeah, my palace has waterfalls. Boom. World wonder. Either way, the gardens prove something essential about humanity. We'd rather believe in beauty that never existed than admit we lost track of reality somewhere between Babylon and wishful thinking. After the Hanging Gardens' possible non-existence, Greece decided to restore faith in humanity's architectural ego with something that definitely existed. A massive gold and ivory statue of Zeus sitting on a throne the size of an apartment complex. Built around 435 BCE by Phidias, the same sculptor who decorated the Parthenon, the statue of Zeus at Olympia was the ultimate flex in divine branding. He didn't just carve the king of gods, he upholstered him. The body was ivory, the robe was hammered gold, and the throne was encrusted with gems and mythical beasts. It was less holy sight, and more Olympian Versace showroom. People travelled from across Greece to see it. Some wept at its beauty, others fainted from the sheer scale. According to ancient reports, Zeus looked so lifelike that one visitor claimed he felt the god's presence in the room. Which, let's be honest, probably means the ventilation was terrible. The statue sat in a temple at Olympia for nearly 1,000 years. But gold and ivory don't age well, especially in a wooden building lit by oil lamps. Fires, humidity, and earthquakes all tried to ruin it. But the Greeks, being stubborn, just kept polishing it. Eventually, when the Roman Empire took over, they decided to move Zeus to Constantinople, presumably to keep him safe from people who believed in him too much. That didn't go well. A fire destroyed the palace it was housed in, and Zeus, ironic as ever, was finally struck down by the very element he ruled over in myth. Imagine surviving centuries of war only to lose everything to bad wiring. Today all that's left are coins and descriptions from writers who probably exaggerated. The temple still stands in ruins, though, empty, solemn, and quietly mocking modern tourists who stare at its remains and ask, "So, where's the statue? The statue of Zeus teaches a timeless lesson. Never build something out of flammable god parts." It also proves that even the greatest religious icons can't survive the one true deity that rules us all. Poor fire safety standards. If the ancient world had social media, the Temple of Artemis would have been trending daily, all marble, gold, and zero subtlety. Built in Ephesus around 550 BCE, it was an architectural love letter to excess. Dedicated to Artemis, goddess of the hunt and conveniently good taste, it was so large that people described it as a home fit for the gods, which is historian speak for ridiculously over budget. Picture this: 127 marble columns, each 60 feet tall, supporting a roof carved with scenes of myth, animals, and glory. It glittered with gold and jewels, glowing under torchlight like a divine nightclub. The priests, artisans, and sponsors all claimed to have built it for Artemis. But let's be honest, no one builds a wonder that size for modesty. Then came Herostratus, the original influencer. In 356 BCE, he decided that fame, any fame, was worth it. So he burned the temple to the ground. No manifesto, no politics, just pure clout chasing. His reasoning? If he couldn't be remembered for building something great, he'd settle for destroying it. The authorities, appalled but also slightly impressed, executed him and banned his name from history, which of course guaranteed immortality. Congratulations, humanity. The first viral arsonist was born. Even weirder, the temple burned on the same night Alexander the Great was born. Ancient historians loved this coincidence, claiming Artemis was too busy attending the birth of greatness to save her own house. Which sounds poetic until you remember they said this after it happened. Because hindsight makes everyone a prophet. Ephesus eventually rebuilt the temple. Twice, actually. Each time grander than before, because apparently no one in antiquity learned about fireproofing. It stood for centuries before being looted by Goths and dismantled by early Christians who saw pagan architecture and thought, free marble. Today, only one column remains, standing in a swamp like the last tooth in a ruined smile. The Temple of Artemis may be gone, but Herostratus's legacy endures, proof that burning things down for attention has a long and noble tradition. Somewhere, deep down, he's still trending. After Herostratus turned the Temple of Artemis into history's hottest bonfire, the people of Ephesus decided to rebuild it, because nothing says resilience like immediately recreating the thing that just caught fire. This time, they promised, it would be even grander. Bigger columns, finer marble, more gold, less arson, ideally. They spared no expense. The new version took decades and mountains of wealth. Even Alexander the Great offered to help fund it, though the Ephesians politely declined. They didn't want a king's name carved into their goddess's temple. Admirable principle, until they realized king money buys a lot of marble. Still, the rebuilt temple became one of the most breathtaking sights in the ancient world. Visitors described its marble columns as glowing pink in the dawn, white at noon, and silver under the moonlight. Inside, sculptures of Artemis towered among offerings of gold and ivory. It was less a place of worship, and more an ancient art gallery curated by people with no budget limits and no sense of restraint. But beauty attracts attention. And historically, destruction. In 262 CE, a band of Goths sailed across the Aegean, spotted the glittering masterpiece, and thought, that'll look great on fire. They looted the temple, set it ablaze, and proved that cultural exchange isn't always a good thing. The Ephesians tried to rebuild again, but by then, the empire was crumbling, and Christianity was on the rise. Pagan temples fell out of fashion. The marble was stripped, repurposed, and carried off to build churches and fortresses, recycling in the most brutal sense. By the Middle Ages, the temple was gone. The great goddess of the hunt now presided over a puddle, literally. A swamp formed where the foundations once stood, and for centuries, no one was even sure where it had been. Today, archaeologists have uncovered a few columns and foundation stones. Tourists visit, take photos, and pretend to feel the history. But standing there, staring at one lonely column in a field of mud, you can't help but think, the Temple of Artemis wasn't destroyed once, it just kept giving humanity second chances to mess up. And humanity never disappoints. If you've ever thought modern funerals were expensive, meet Mausolus, the ancient Persian governor of Korea, who basically invented luxury dying. When he kicked the bucket around 353 BCE, his wife and sister, because dynastic marriages loved to multitask, Artemisia II decided to immortalize him with a tomb so grand that it made death look like a career move. The result was the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, a structure so stunning that it gave us the word mausoleum itself, meaning tomb so extra it deserves its own vocabulary. It stood about 140 feet tall, covered in marble, topped with a chariot statue of Mausolus and Artemisia, riding triumphantly into eternity like the world's first posthumous power couple. The best Greek sculptors of the era were hired to decorate it. Each side of the tomb featured elaborate friezes, battles, gods, and heroic nonsense, because even in death, Mausolus wanted everyone to know he was both cultured and terrifying. It wasn't just a burial site, it was a posthumous PR campaign. Artemisia didn't just commission the mausoleum, she reportedly mixed her husband's ashes into her wine and drank it. Historians aren't sure if that's true or if it's just ancient gossip, but either way, it's one of history's most disturbing tributes. Imagine grieving and hydrating at the same time. For nearly 1,800 years, the mausoleum stood tall, surviving invasions, storms, and every kind of political drama Asia Minor could throw at it. But earthquakes eventually did what time and conquerors couldn't. They reduced it to elegant rubble. Medieval knights later raided the remains for building materials, because even crusaders love free marble. Some of those stones are still part of the Bodrum Castle today, which means, technically, Mausolus got reincarnated as a fortress. Today, only the foundation and scattered statues survive, headless warriors, fractured horses, and fragments of royal vanity. Still, the mausoleum remains a symbol of how far humans will go to make sure they're remembered. In life, Mausolus ruled a small kingdom. In death, he built a word that outlived every empire around him. Not bad for a man whose greatest legacy was refusing to rest quietly. By the 3rd century BCE, the island of Rhodes had a problem. It was too rich, too proud, and not nearly famous enough. After successfully surviving a siege by a rival army, the Rhodians decided that what they really needed wasn't better defences, but a 100-foot bronze statue of their sun god Helios. Because nothing screams victory like building something that could double as a lightning rod. The Colossus of Rhodes was a technical miracle, and a financial disaster. It took 12 years and the entire city's bronze reserves to build. When it was done, the thing towered over the harbour, gleaming in the sunlight like a divine supermodel. Accounts say it was so tall, ships could supposedly sail between its legs, which is nonsense, but exactly the kind of nonsense ancient writers loved. If anything, it stood beside the harbour, not over it, unless the Rhodians also invented skyhooks. Built by the sculptor Chares of Lindos, the statue was hollow, a copper shell reinforced with iron and weighted with stones. It was an incredible achievement for a people who didn't even have power tools, and for about 56 glorious years, Rhodes was the selfie capital of the ancient world. Then, in 226 BCE, an earthquake hit. One tremor later, the Colossus was face down in the harbour, broken at the knees, which is poetic, given how many gods in Greek mythology were humbled the same way. The Rhodians saw this as divine punishment and decided not to rebuild, probably realizing that giant metal legs weren't a structural innovation. Still, the fallen Colossus became a tourist attraction in its own right. Ancient travellers wrote that even lying in ruins, it was awe-inspiring, each finger bigger than a man, each limb a mountain of bronze. For 800 years, it stayed that way, until invaders eventually melted it down and sold the scraps. Allegedly, it took 900 camels to haul away the remains. A fitting end for something built purely out of ego and excellent craftsmanship. The Colossus of Rhodes lasted barely half a century, but in that short time it became a metaphor for humanity itself. Impressive, expensive, and absolutely terrible at standing upright for long. When the Colossus of Rhodes collapsed in 226 BCE, most cities would have called it a tragedy. Rhodes, however, called it a tourist attraction. For nearly 800 years, people sailed across the Mediterranean just to gawk at the fallen remains. A god sprawled across the harbour like a cautionary tale about overconfidence. Writers claimed that even in pieces, it was breathtaking. Each thumb was the size of a man. The broken knees were higher than most rooftops. The Rhodians, being practical people, left the statue exactly where it fell. Moving 100 feet of bronze was too expensive, and besides, it looked dramatic. Imagine living in a city where your main landmark was a giant corpse made of metal. That's ancient urban planning at its finest. The Oracle of Delphi eventually declared that rebuilding the Colossus would offend Helios, the sun god himself, a convenient excuse when you can't afford another one. So Rhodes let it be. The statue stayed on the ground, gathering admiration, myths, and probably a few seagulls. But bronze doesn't stay idle forever. In 654 CE, an army from Syria under Muawiyah captured Rhodes. Seeing the giant remains, they did what any sensible conqueror would: recycled them. The statue was melted down and sold as scrap metal to a merchant from Edessa. According to later sources, it took 900 camels to carry all the bronze away, though ancient historians loved round numbers almost as much as exaggeration. And just like that, one of humanity's grandest creations became a literal commodity. Imagine standing before one of the 7 wonders of the world and thinking, yeah, this would make a great frying pan. But that's the story of civilization. We build wonders to show our greatness, then sell them for parts when rent's due. Ironically, this recycling spree ensured the Colossus outlived itself. Its metal was melted, reforged, and scattered across centuries, bits of Helios ending up in weapons, tools, and maybe even jewellery. In death, the statue finally achieved immortality, just not the kind its creators imagined. The Colossus of Rhodes may have fallen, but it still shines, just in smaller, more affordable pieces. If the ancient world had a Most Likely to Succeed award, it would have gone to the Lighthouse of Alexandria, the one wonder that actually served a practical purpose. Built around 280 BCE on the island of Pharos, it wasn't just a monument, it was GPS before GPS. It guided ships safely into Egypt's bustling harbour, prevented wrecks, and doubled as a 350-foot-tall flex saying, "Welcome to Alexandria, we're smarter than you." Commissioned by Ptolemy I and finished under his son Ptolemy II, the lighthouse was designed by Sostratus of Cnidus, a man whose job title was probably architect, but whose soul screamed overachiever. It was built in 3 tiers, a square base, an octagonal middle, and a cylindrical top. Because when you're inventing skyscrapers 2,000 years early, symmetry is optional. At its peak blazed an open flame, amplified by polished bronze mirrors that reflected light across the sea. According to some accounts, it could be seen from 30 miles away, which, if true, means it was either incredibly bright or ancient sailors had excellent eyesight. Others claim the mirrors could focus sunlight and set enemy ships on fire. Basically, an ancient death ray. More likely it was just the world's first overpowered porch light, but like every wonder, it came with maintenance issues. Storms battered it, salt eroded its walls, and the occasional seagull probably set off small fires. Over the centuries, the structure endured countless earthquakes, until it didn't. Between the 10th and 14th centuries, repeated quakes finally brought it down in slow motion. First the top, then the middle, and finally the base, a millennia-long demolition nobody asked for. The remains sank beneath the harbour, where they rested quietly for 700 years. Rediscovered only in the 1990s by underwater archaeologists who probably felt like kids finding buried treasure. Massive granite blocks, carved statues, even the colossal foundation stones, all still there, as if the sea had been guarding them. The lighthouse of Alexandria didn't just shine for ships, it symbolized human genius, and our inability to leave well enough alone. We reached for the stars, built a lighthouse toward them, and then forgot to earthquake-proof it. The lighthouse of Alexandria didn't collapse all at once. It died slowly, like most great ideas do. The first earthquake hit in 956 CE, cracking the base. Locals patched it up with the ancient equivalent of duct tape and optimism. Then came more quakes in 1303 and 1323, both so strong they flattened entire sections of Egypt's coast. The lighthouse, after standing tall for over 1,000 years, finally gave in and sank beneath the waves. And just like that, the brightest creation of the ancient world was gone, undone not by war or greed, but by geology. The irony is almost too poetic. A monument built to defy nature, slowly reclaimed by it. The sea, patient as ever, took back what humanity borrowed. By the time the Mamluks ruled Egypt, the ruins of the lighthouse were little more than coral-coated stones at the bottom of the harbour. In 1480, Sultan Qaitbay built a fortress right on top of the ruins, recycling the same blocks. That's ancient efficiency for you. If it's already in the water, just build on it. The fort of Qaitbay still stands today, technically making it the lighthouse's third career after navigation and underwater archaeology. For centuries, sailors still claimed to see strange lights flickering beneath the waves near Pharos. Ghost stories, perhaps, or just the way history glows faintly even when buried. It's fitting, really. The lighthouse began as a symbol of human ambition and ended as an invisible legend beneath the tide. What makes its story special isn't just the brilliance of its design, but the absurdity of its endurance. It lasted nearly 1,500 years, longer than most nations, empires, or religions. It outlived the Ptolemies, the Romans, the Byzantines, and half of recorded patience. When it finally fell, nobody rebuilt it. The world had moved on to cathedrals, castles, and gunpowder. Light had become divine again, not architectural. But somewhere under the Mediterranean, in that murky green twilight, lies a reminder. Even the brightest things fade. Sometimes gracefully, sometimes with a splash. The lighthouse of Alexandria didn't just collapse. It bowed out, as all wonders eventually do. One tremor, one wave, one sigh of the earth at a time. By the time the lighthouse of Alexandria crumbled into the sea, the other 6 wonders had already packed up and left the stage. Fires, earthquakes, and human stupidity had taken care of them all. Only one remained, the Great Pyramid of Giza, standing alone in the desert like that one co-worker who actually reads the company emails. It's poetic, really. The oldest of the 7 wonders turned out to be the only survivor. While its marble-clad cousins drowned, burned, or got repurposed into fortresses, the pyramid just sat there for 4,000 years, quietly refusing to fall apart. No miracles, no divine protection, just good engineering and the world's driest climate. The irony? The Great Pyramid wasn't even supposed to be the most glamorous. To the Greeks it was ancient even in their time, old, dusty, and lacking artistic flair. But sometimes durability wins over beauty. The pyramid outlasted them all by simply existing where nothing grows, nothing floods, and no one could afford to move 6 million tons of limestone. For centuries, it survived wars, tomb robbers, and the occasional Napoleon visit. The Arabs stripped its outer limestone casing for city construction, turning Giza's dazzling white beacon into the sand-coloured mountain we know today. And yet, even naked, it remains magnificent. A monument so mathematically precise that it's aligned almost perfectly with true north, something modern architects still occasionally mess up even with laser tools and coffee. The other wonders had purpose. Temples, tombs, shrines, tourist traps. The pyramid's only job was to guard a dead man's ego. And somehow, that's the one thing humanity built to last. You could argue that's fitting. Nothing survives longer than vanity. Today, the Great Pyramid still stares down the centuries, while tourists queue up to take blurry photos and conspiracy theorists debate how it was built. It's the last monument of a list that time tried to erase, the original overachiever, still showing up when everyone else called in dead. Every other wonder became a ghost. The Great Pyramid? It's still on duty, quietly outliving kings, conquerors, and the attention span of civilization itself. So, what really happened to the 7 wonders of the world? Fire, earthquakes, greed, and the unstoppable march of time. Otherwise known as the 4 horsemen of poor planning. We built monuments to eternity and then watched them crumble like overconfident sandcastles. The Great Pyramid survived not because it was divine, but because it had the common sense to sit in the desert and mind its own business. The rest? They fell to a familiar pattern, humans building too big, too proud, and too close to fault lines. The Hanging Gardens may never have existed. The Temple of Artemis was burned for attention. The statue of Zeus melted in a fire, proving that gold and ivory make better jewellery than architecture. The mausoleum collapsed under earthquakes and irony. The Colossus of Rhodes met gravity halfway, and the Lighthouse of Alexandria drowned in its own brilliance. Yet their stories survived. Exaggerated, retold, half lost in translation, half invented out of pride. Humanity's greatest monuments are really just the most stubborn rumours. Maybe that's the secret. A wonder only truly dies when people stop telling the story. In their ruins lies a message we keep ignoring. Every empire builds things to last forever. Temples, palaces, brands. And every empire eventually learns that forever has a short attention span. Marble cracks, bronze melts. Even gods go out of fashion. The only thing that endures is the desire to build again, just to see if maybe this time we'll get it right. Still, there's beauty in that failure. The 7 wonders weren't about perfection. They were about defiance. Each one said, "We were here." And when time erased them, it didn't feel like defeat. It felt inevitable, like watching your masterpiece wash away at sunset and knowing someone, somewhere, will start sculpting again tomorrow. The ruins remind us that greatness is temporary, but the impulse to chase it isn't. Humanity's legacy isn't what we built. It's that we kept building, even after everything fell apart. And perhaps that's the real 8th wonder of the world. Our ability to repeat the same mistake beautifully, every single time. Kyoto's Gion district shimmered under the glow of thousands of lanterns, each one reflecting off the lacquered wood of tea-house doors and silk parasols gliding through narrow alleys. Inside those walls of rice paper and cedar, another world began when the sun sank, a world where laughter, poetry, and longing intertwined like smoke from burning incense. These were the pleasure houses of Edo, Japan, places where time slowed and reality dissolved into art. But they were not dens of lust. Not exactly. They were sanctuaries of illusion, where pleasure was performed like theatre and intimacy was elevated to ritual. Men came not to touch, but to dream. Behind every sliding door waited not a mistress, but a muse, a woman trained in music, poetry, and wit. The air smelled faintly of plum blossoms and sake. A geisha's voice, light as mist, recited a haiku that could stir more desire than the most revealing gesture. The paper walls muffled the outside world. The clang of samurai armour, the merchants haggling in the streets, the gossip of courtiers, all vanished once you stepped inside. Here, a client might sit cross-legged on tatami mats, heart racing as a woman poured him tea, never meeting his eyes directly. The act itself, the pause, the silence, the sound of fabric brushing across the floor, carried more tension than any embrace could. Every movement had meaning. Every look was choreography. To outsiders, it was an enigma. How could something so restrained feel so intimate? But to those who understood the rules, every unspoken moment was electric. Pleasure was never about exposure. It was about suggestion. In this floating world, ukiyo, as the Japanese called it, beauty lived in impermanence. The geisha's performance was fleeting, like cherry blossoms carried by wind. The pleasure house existed to capture that fleeting beauty, to turn the ephemeral into memory. When dawn arrived, the paper walls glowed once more, revealing the truth. Nothing within them had been real. Yet for one night, within that dimly lit room filled with music and longing, illusion had been enough. That was the secret of Edo pleasure, not indulgence, but the exquisite art of restraint. Iki, the soul of Edo's sensual world, was more than a word. It was a philosophy, a code, and a form of rebellion wrapped in elegance. Born in the merchant quarters of the 17th century, Iki shaped how men and women moved, spoke, and even desired. It rejected excess and vulgarity, favouring simplicity, grace, and subtle charm. To be Iki was to master the art of almost, of hinting, not showing, of feeling, not taking. A geisha's power came not from beauty alone, but from this mastery of suggestion. Her glance could linger for just a breath longer than expected. Never enough to break propriety, but enough to spark a quiet fire. When she poured sake, her sleeve slipped just enough to show the curve of a wrist, an accident too deliberate to be chance. Her laughter, soft and knowing, told the guest that she understood him better than he understood himself. That was Aiki, to balance on the edge between desire and denial without falling. Unlike the courtesans of the high-ranking Yujo houses, whose allure was wrapped in ornament and luxury, the geisha embodied restraint. She wore muted colours instead of gaudy golds, spoke through poetry instead of promises. Her sensuality came from refinement, from how she moved, how she listened, how she carried silence. The Aiki woman didn't chase attention. She drew it as effortlessly as the moon pulls the tide. In the dim light of the Ochaya tea house, the merchant who had spent his day haggling over rice or silk found himself disarmed. Here, wealth and status mattered less than wit and conversation. To match a geisha's intellect was often more intoxicating than touching her skin. Many left poorer in coin, but richer in longing, carrying home the memory of a single glance that haunted them more than any embrace could. Iki became Edo's secret aesthetic, the invisible perfume that lingered over every fan dance, every haiku, every song played on the shamisen. It was the antidote to vulgarity and the quiet rebellion against a rigid world. In the pleasure houses, where illusion was law, Iki was the highest form of truth, proof that the finest pleasures were never taken, only imagined. Before a geisha could step into the candlelight, years of discipline shaped her into something beyond mortal charm, an artist of illusion. The courtesan's craft was a delicate alchemy, blending art, etiquette, and theatre into a single, fluid performance. From the moment she was apprenticed as a maiko, her education began. Dance, calligraphy, flower arranging, shamisen, poetry, and, most elusive of all, conversation. Every skill existed to refine the art of emotional control. A geisha's allure was not a natural gift. It was constructed layer by layer, like the silks she wore. Her speech had to flow like music, her gestures as deliberate as brushstrokes on parchment. She learned to laugh softly, never loudly. To pause mid-sentence, just long enough to let her listener lean closer. To walk so silently that her presence felt like a drifting fragrance. What others called seduction, she called balance. The okiya, or geisha house, functioned like a finishing school and a cage. The okasan, the house mother, ran it with the precision of a general. Debts were high, freedom rare. Each girl owed years of training, kimono costs, and performance fees. Yet within those constraints, many found power. A successful geisha could command more respect and wealth than most merchants, her wit sharper than a sword, her grace more disarming than any weapon. When she entertained guests at the ozashiki banquets, she became both mirror and mask. She could flatter a samurai's ego, match a poet's rhythm, or tease a merchant into laughter that emptied his purse. The pleasure she offered wasn't physical, It was intellectual intoxication. Each exchange was a game of subtlety, where the first to speak of desire lost the match. Her appearance completed the illusion. The heavy white makeup, the crimson lips, the intricate kanzashi hairpins, all symbols of transformation. She became an archetype, a living poem, her real self hidden behind ritual. The courtesan's craft was, above all, the art of distance. To make men feel they were closer than they truly were. To create an intimacy built not on touch, but on imagination. For in Edo's pleasure houses, fantasy was the only truth, and the geisha, its perfect illusionist. To call the Edo pleasure houses brothels was to misunderstand them entirely. They were theatres, and the courtesans their leading actresses. Every evening, as lanterns flickered alive, the yukaku, licensed quarters, transformed into a stage where illusion was everything. Guests did not simply arrive for indulgence. They came to be transported, to escape the rigid codes of the samurai era, into a dream spun of silk and song. The night would begin with ritual. Slippers removed, egos set aside. The guest was led through narrow corridors lined with painted screens, images of cranes, plum blossoms, and moonlit rivers, each chosen to stir emotion before a single word was spoken. Then came the sound of the shamisen. Its strings echoed through the room, a sound both lonely and seductive, like a whisper that knew too much. The geisha would enter, her presence measured, her gaze deliberate, as if she had stepped out of a dream and wasn't sure she wanted to return. The performance was never spontaneous. Every detail, from the folding of a fan to the pace of a bow, was choreographed to perfection. Yet within that precision lived improvisation, a flash of humour, a line of poetry, a glance that lingered a second too long. The art lay in making artifice feel like fate. The guest might believe he was the one being courted, unaware that he was being guided, step by step, deeper into the emotional labyrinth she designed. In this theatre of desire, the goal was not seduction but suspension, to hold a man between yearning and fulfillment, to let him drown in the illusion of being understood. And when the evening ended, no promises were made, no hearts confessed. The curtain simply fell with the closing of a shoji door. Outside, the city stirred again, merchants shouting, sake being poured, the real world reclaiming its grip. But for those few hours, within the paper walls of the pleasure house, life had felt different, softer, timeless. That was the magic of Edo's hidden theatre. It made even the loneliest man believe he had been seen, even if it was only by a shadow cast in candlelight. If words were the soul of the pleasure house, then music was its heartbeat. The sound of the shamisen, a three-stringed lute plucked with precision, echoed through the wooden corridors, pulling guests into a trance they never wished to break. Its tone was haunting and tender, evoking both melancholy and desire. One could not tell if it sang of love, loss, or longing, and perhaps that was the point. In Edo's floating world, emotions were deliberately blurred. The geisha did not merely play the shamisen, she conversed through it. Every note answered a question unspoken. Every pause lingered like a sigh. When she performed the kuta, short lyrical songs of the city's heart, she drew from the rhythm of everyday life, the rustle of kimonos, the flutter of fans, the faint rain on the tiled rooftops. Her music was not about performance. It was about communion, about sharing the hidden pulse of feeling that language could not express. The audience listened not as spectators, but as participants. The merchant who had spent his day counting coins now sat still, feeling the trembling strings stir something money could never buy. The samurai who once knew only the clash of swords found a different kind of battle here, one fought in rhythm and silence. The geisha's power was not to dominate, but to disarm, to make her listener forget the outside world entirely. Other sounds joined the shamisen, the delicate tap of a hand drum, the whisper of a folding fan, the faint laughter of women behind screens. Together, they formed a living composition, a soundscape of desire, civility, and play. Every house had its own ensemble, each piece finely tuned to create an atmosphere that walked the line between the sacred and the sensual. For in Edo's pleasure quarters, seduction was never loud. It was music that stayed behind in the guest's mind, long after he left. A melody that resurfaced when he smelled incense or saw the flicker of a paper lantern. The song did not end with the night. It lived on in memory. And that was the geisha's truest art. To compose not with sound, but with the lingering ache of silence. The geisha's dance was the purest embodiment of Edo's restrained sensuality. A language of movement where every gesture whispered what words dared not say. Under the soft glow of lanterns, she appeared in layers of silk that seemed to breathe with her, each fold and colour carefully chosen to evoke emotion. Her fan opened like a secret, her eyes followed its arc, and with one turn of the wrist, she could make a man believe time itself had stopped. This was Mai, the slow and deliberate dance that demanded precision and patience. Unlike the wild, theatrical movements of kabuki, Mai was subtle, inward, almost meditative. It was not meant to dazzle, but to draw the viewer into a trance. The audience's breath slowed to match hers. Their minds filled the silence between each motion. In those pauses, those still, aching moments, lay the true tension. The pleasure of the unseen, the beauty of the unsaid. Training for such control took years. As a maiko, a young apprentice, a girl learned to balance a fan between her fingertips while keeping her gaze soft yet focused. She studied the flow of the seasons, cherry blossoms, autumn leaves, winter snow, and learned how to translate their fleeting grace into movement. A single tilt of the head could symbolize a year's worth of longing. A step forward might mean surrender. A step back, resistance. To the untrained eye, it was slow. To the initiated, it was spellbinding. The dancer's world was one of rhythm and restraint, a performance that rewarded attention, not appetite. When she performed Kyomai, the Kyoto-style dance, her poise seemed almost divine. Her body was not an object, but an instrument of elegance, her movements deliberate enough to awaken desire without ever inviting it. For the guests, the dance was not about possession, but participation, an emotional dialogue carried out in silence. When the final pose froze and the last note faded, no applause broke the spell. Only stillness as the audience exhaled together. In that hush lay the essence of Edo's pleasure, suggestion over satisfaction, grace over hunger, and the eternal art of wanting without ever having. When the music faded and the dances ended, what remained was conversation, quiet, careful, and intoxicating in its own way. In Edo's pleasure houses, intimacy began not with touch, but with words. Poetry was the bridge between hearts, the weapon of charm sharper than any blade. A well-placed verse could stir more longing than a kiss, and a pause between syllables could ache more than silence itself. A geisha was trained to read a man's emotions like calligraphy, to know where the ink thickened, where the line trembled. When a guest arrived, she did not ask about business or politics. Instead, she asked about the moon, the sound of rain, the colour of plum blossoms that season. It was a ritual of subtle confession. Through metaphor and haiku, she drew out desires too delicate to speak plainly. The poetry of Edo was filled with this quiet tension. A merchant might write, "The cup of sake. I lift it to my lips, yet still her eyes pour the wine." And the geisha, smiling faintly, might reply, "You drink too slowly, for the moon will fade by dawn, as will my promise." Each line was layered with double meaning. Flirtation hidden in elegance, longing disguised as art. These exchanges turned the pleasure house into a salon of intellect as much as desire. The men who entered left behind the noise of the city for something rarer, to be understood without being exposed. Many guests fell in love not with the woman, but with her words. They carried her poems folded in sleeves or tucked inside books, reading them by candlelight long after the night had ended. The geisha knew this, and wrote accordingly. Her poetry was not for permanence, but for haunting. To master such dialogue was to master control, for even as she unveiled her heart in verse, she kept its centre hidden. That was the true artistry of intimacy in Edo's world, to share emotion without surrender, to build a bond so fragile it existed only in memory. And in that fleeting connection, between poet and listener, between illusion and truth, lay the purest pleasure of all. In Edo's floating world, love was both the greatest illusion and the most dangerous truth. The pleasure houses thrived on it, not the love of flesh, but of imagination. Men entered believing they could be loved. Women performed believing they could not. Yet somewhere between sack cups and whispered verses, the boundary blurred. That was the genius, and cruelty, of the world behind the paper walls. For a geisha, affection was an act of craftsmanship. She learned to offer attention without attachment, tenderness without vulnerability. Her smile had to suggest devotion, but never promise it. To a lonely merchant, her laughter felt like sunlight. To a weary samurai, her stillness felt like peace. But when dawn came, the illusion dissolved like mist. What remained was emptiness. Sweet, addictive emptiness that ensured his return. Some guests, lost in fantasy, mistook the illusion for truth. They wrote letters, offered fortunes, even begged for exclusivity. A few were granted it, Dana, the patron. But even then, the bond remained a transaction, bound by etiquette rather than passion. A geisha's first duty was to her art, her house, and her freedom, not to love. For love, in her world, was the one indulgence she could not afford. Yet the irony was cruel. To perform desire so convincingly, she had to understand it deeply. She could not fake the glimmer in her eyes or the warmth in her tone without once having felt its sting. The line between illusion and emotion became a tightrope she walked nightly, risking her heart for the sake of her craft. Still, the fantasy had its beauty. The illusion gave meaning to both sides, to the guest who longed, and to the geisha who pretended not to. Within that fragile lie existed a rare form of truth, that love, like art, need not be real to be felt. When morning light crept through the shoji screens, the world outside resumed, merchants hurrying, samurai marching, courtiers scheming. Inside, the room still smelled of incense and memory. The pillow was untouched. The illusion had ended, but not the ache it left behind. For in Edo's pleasure, houses, love was never consummated, only performed, perfected, and eternally unfinished. By the mid-19th century, the floating world, ukiyo, began to sink. The same isolation that once protected its beauty now sealed its fate. The Edo period was ending. The Meiji Restoration had begun. Steamships, factories, and foreign influence swept through Japan like a tide, washing away the delicate sand patterns of an old garden. The pleasure quarters, once the heart of refinement, started to lose their glow. Lanterns flickered dimmer, and the songs that once promised eternity now sounded like elegies. The geisha, once guardians of elegance, faced a changing audience. The samurai who had once sought solace in their company were gone, stripped of power and privilege. Merchants became industrialists. Courtesans became curiosities. The very art of iki, the language of suggestion and restraint, struggled to survive in a world obsessed with progress and exposure. What was once mysterious now seemed outdated in the bright glare of modernization. Some pleasure houses closed, others turned vulgar, abandoning poetry for profit. The refined music of the shamisen gave way to louder entertainments, imported fashions, and a new generation that no longer understood the beauty of silence. Yet, amidst the collapse, a few women clung to tradition. They kept performing, kept writing, kept dancing, not for fame or wealth, but to preserve the ghost of something sacred. Their devotion kept the embers of ukiyo glowing, even as the city around them forgot how to dream. The Westerners who arrived in Japan often mistook the geisha for prostitutes, never realizing the centuries of artistry that shaped her craft. To them, she was an exotic curiosity. To those who remembered Edo, she was the last living echo of a vanished world, a moving poem dressed in silk and sorrow. By the time the old districts fell silent, the paper walls had witnessed the full cycle of beauty, its rise, its perfection, and its inevitable decay. Yet, even as the pleasure houses vanished, the spirit of Iki lived on, in modern tea ceremonies, in fashion, in the quiet grace of Japanese cinema. The floating world did not drown, it drifted into memory, and though its lanterns are long extinguished, their light still flickers in every art that values mystery over revelation, and suggestion over desire. In the steaming jungles of Mesoamerica, long before the rise of Rome or Athens, the Maya built stone arenas where gods and men shared the same ground. These were not mere courts of play. They were sacred battlegrounds known as Pok-ta-Pok fields, where the stakes were nothing less than cosmic balance. Every match was a ritual reenactment of the eternal struggle between light and darkness, life and death, the sun and the shadow that devoured it each night. The ball court itself was a microcosm of the Maya universe. Its narrow shape mirrored the path of the sun as it travelled through the heavens and into the underworld. The walls rose like the edges of reality, their carved serpent heads swallowing the echoes of the rubber ball, a sound the Maya likened to thunder, the pulse of divine life. To step into that court was to enter the realm of gods, where every motion had meaning, and every mistake could draw blood. The players were not athletes in the modern sense, but chosen vessels, warriors, nobles, or even captives, selected to perform the sacred duel that bound their world together. Their bodies glistened with oil, adorned with jade ornaments, feathers, and leather padding. They moved with the precision of dancers, their every strike, twist, and dodge a prayer written in motion. The rules forbade them from using hands or feet. Only hips, knees, and elbows could touch the heavy, solid rubber ball that weighed nearly 9 pounds, a sphere dense enough to break ribs or shatter skulls. Spectators filled the surrounding terraces, priests chanting, nobles wagering, and commoners whispering prayers for rain, harvest, or victory. The game was not just entertainment, it was fate made visible. The sun's survival depended on their skill, their endurance, their sacrifice. At the heart of the ceremony stood the idea of cosmic duty. The court was a stage where the gods tested human devotion, where each collision between ball and stone was believed to sustain the rhythm of the universe. To play Pok-ta-Pok was to dance with eternity, and when the echoes of the game finally faded into the jungle night, the Maya believed the gods themselves had been watching, waiting to decide whether balance had been restored or chaos would reign once more. The ball itself was sacred, a symbol of the sun, born from the sap of the rubber tree, heavy enough to wound and holy enough to worship. When it struck the stone walls of the court, the echo was said to be the heartbeat of the cosmos. To the Maya, this was not a simple object. It was the living embodiment of the sun god, descending each day into the underworld, only to rise again, if the game was played correctly. Crafted from hardened latex, and sometimes mixed with herbs or blood, the Pok-ta-Pok ball was dense, weighing nearly 9 pounds. A single strike to the chest could bruise the lungs, a misplaced hit could break a rib or knock a player unconscious. Yet the danger was part of its sanctity. Each bounce was the sun's pulse, each rebound a struggle to keep the light alive. Players could not touch it with their hands or feet, only their hips, elbows and knees, the most symbolically pure parts of the body. To strike the ball cleanly was an act of divine alignment. In Maya mythology, the hero twins, Hunahpu and Ixbalanque, once played this very game against the gods of the underworld. Their victory secured the renewal of the sun and the cycle of life itself. Every match of Pok-ta-Pok echoed that mythic duel. The players were not competing for victory alone, but for cosmic balance, to replay the myth so that dawn would come again. Before each match, priests anointed the ball with offerings, maize flour, copal incense, or even the blood of the players. The ceremony blurred the line between game and ritual. Once the ball was cast into play, all laughter ceased. It was no longer sport. It was the movement of the universe itself. Spectators held their breath as the ball ricocheted between bodies and stone. The rhythm of the match became hypnotic, as if time bent to its pulse. Each successful strike drew cheers that echoed through the city, for it meant the sun had not yet fallen into darkness. To lose control of the ball was to lose light, to fail the gods. For in the world of the Maya, every game was a sunrise waiting to be won. To play Pok-ta-Pok was to step into the skin of the gods. The men chosen for the court were not mere athletes. They were warriors, nobles, and sometimes captives marked by fate. Each match blurred the line between sport and sacrifice, glory and doom. For the Maya, the players embodied cosmic forces, the sun's champions battling the shadows that sought to devour it. Before the match, they purified their bodies with smoke and prayer. Priests painted sacred glyphs on their chests, invoking divine strength. Feathers adorned their arms, and belts of leather and jade shielded their hips, the instruments of the game. These belts, called yokes, were both armour and symbol. They protected the body, but also represented the cosmic centre, the point where heaven and earth met. When the ball struck the yoke, it was as though the player had intercepted the sun itself, keeping it from descending into eternal night. The elite players were revered like heroes, their names etched into stone monuments beside kings and gods. To win was to secure honour for one city, to bring fertility to the land, to ensure the gods' favour for another year. But victory could also mean death. Some scholars believe that in the most sacred games, the winners, not the losers, were sacrificed. To die after victory was not tragedy, it was transcendence. The blood of the triumphant was believed to nourish the gods, ensuring the continued cycle of life and light. Yet the opposite fate could befall prisoners of war. Defeated captives were sometimes forced into the game as doomed participants, their failure symbolizing the triumph of darkness. Their deaths reminded all who watched that the sun's journey was never guaranteed. It depended on courage, endurance, and divine grace. When the players entered the court, silence fell. They moved like celestial bodies, each motion deliberate, each impact echoing through stone and time. The crowd knew they were witnessing more than a match. It was a reenactment of the universe's most sacred drama. The warriors of the sun played not for fame or survival, but for balance itself, for the fragile light that separated existence from the eternal shadow waiting beyond the walls. No game of Pok-ta-Pok began without blood. To the Maya, blood was life, the bridge between mortal flesh and divine power. It was the currency with which humans repaid the gods for the gift of creation. Before the first strike of the ball, priests would anoint the court with sacred offerings, maize, jade dust, and drops of human blood drawn through ritual piercing. The players too offered themselves, pricking their tongues or earlobes so that the gods might bless the match. The air hung heavy with incense, smoke, and reverence. The crowd gathered not merely to watch, but to witness a sacred negotiation. The game decided not who was stronger, but whether the balance of the world still held. Every successful strike meant the sun still burned. Every miss hinted at the creeping victory of darkness. The chants of priests mixed with the sound of the ball, each echo reverberating like a heartbeat through the stone walls. When the match ended, glory demanded blood once more. The sacrifice, whether of the victorious or the defeated, was the climax of the ritual. Some Maya cities, like Chichen Itza, depicted scenes of victorious players holding the decapitated heads of their opponents, from which serpents, symbols of life and renewal, emerged instead of blood. Death in this context was transformation, not punishment. The sacrificed body became an offering to the gods, ensuring the continuation of the cosmic cycle. The method of sacrifice was itself a ceremony. Victims were purified, painted, and adorned before being led to the altar. The executioner's blade was sacred obsidian, its edge sharp enough to divide the veil between life and eternity. The moment of death was believed to release divine energy, a burst of light returning to the heavens. For the Maya, to die upon the ball court was to transcend mortality. It meant joining the hero twins in their mythic triumph over the underworld, becoming part of the sun's eternal voyage. Those who shed blood did not lose. They fulfilled their purpose. And when the crimson flowed into the cracks of the stone, the priests declared the gods satisfied. The game ended not with cheers, but with silence, the solemn calm of a universe briefly restored to balance. As the game unfolded, every strike of the ball mirrored a myth far older than any city, the journey of the sun through Xibalba, the Maya underworld. This was the realm of shadows, ruled by death gods who delighted in deceit and pain. To the Maya, the ball court was not just a field of play, it was the threshold between worlds. When the ball rolled along the stone floor, it symbolized the sun descending into darkness. When it rose again, rebounding toward the sky, it became the dawn reborn. The myth of the hero twins, Hunahpu and Ixbalanque, gave divine meaning to every movement. In the sacred texts of the Popol Vuh, the twins were summoned to Xibalba to play against the underworld lords, who sought to destroy them. The gods of death cheated, deceived, and set impossible traps. Yet the twins used wit, courage, and sacrifice to triumph, ultimately resurrecting themselves as the sun and the moon. The ball game was their story eternalized, a living ritual to ensure that light would always return after night. To the Maya spectators, this was not entertainment, but participation. When they watched the players dive, collide, and strike the ball, they were witnessing the cosmic struggle replayed, the same drama that kept the universe alive. The players were avatars of the hero twins, their movements choreographed by destiny, their sweat mingled with divine purpose. Even the architecture of the court was designed as a symbolic gateway. The rings through which the ball was sometimes cast were placed high upon the walls, circles representing portals to the heavens. But the narrow alleys and deep shadows of the court symbolized Xibalba itself. To miss the mark, to let the ball fall dead on the ground, was to let the sun vanish into the underworld forever. At night, when the torches burned low and the game ended, the court would fall silent, a stone wound in the heart of the city. The Maya believed the spirits of the dead players lingered there, forever replaying the divine match beyond mortal sight. And as long as the echoes of Pok-ta-Pok rang through the jungle, it meant the sun's light and life itself had not yet been lost to the shadows. Across the Maya world, from Copan to Chichen Itza, hundreds of ball courts stood as monuments to faith and geometry. They were built not for comfort or spectacle, but for alignment with the cosmos. Each arena was a fusion of engineering, astronomy, and theology, a stage where mortals could touch eternity. The walls were steep, smooth, and unforgiving, amplifying every sound until it seemed the gods themselves were listening. The largest courts could stretch more than 500 feet long, their limestone surfaces polished by centuries of ritual. The shape was always the same, a long, narrow corridor framed by two parallel walls, forming the outline of the Maya glyph for sky. The open ends symbolized the passage between life and death, while the center, where the ball struck and rebounded, represented the axis of the world, the meeting point of heaven, earth, and the underworld. In cities like Chichen Itza, the court was surrounded by carvings that made its purpose unmistakable. Reliefs depicted armored players, coiled serpents, and decapitated figures sprouting vines, the unmistakable sign that death led to rebirth. The sound of the ball was said to awaken these carvings, each echo vibrating with the voice of the gods. When the sun reached its zenith, light struck the court in perfect alignment, turning the game into a celestial ritual. The acoustics were deliberate. A single clap or shout could bounce between the walls and return amplified, an architectural invocation. Archaeologists have noted that at some courts, the echo mimics the call of the sacred Quetzal bird, the symbol of freedom and divine light. To the Maya, this was no coincidence. It was communication between realms. proof that their architecture was not merely physical, but spiritual. Every detail had meaning. The stairs where priests stood to oversee the match represented ascension to the heavens. The darkened tunnels where captives waited symbolized descent into the underworld. Even the direction the court faced was intentional. Many aligned east to west, following the sun's journey across the sky. To play within such a structure was to stand at the intersection of myth and matter. The ball court was not a human invention, but a reflection of the universe itself, carved in stone, echoing with eternity. When the match began, the world beyond the court seemed to vanish. The stands filled with nobles, priests and commoners, yet the true spectators, the Maya believed, were not of this earth. The gods watched from the heavens, their gaze fixed on the moving ball that symbolized the sun's fragile voyage across the sky. Every strike, every fall, every rebound carried cosmic weight. To miss the ball was to falter before the gods. To score was to restore order to the universe. The human audience, though mortal, shared in this sacred tension. Nobles sat in the front rows beneath canopies of woven palm, their faces painted with red ochre, eyes glinting with anticipation. Merchants, artisans and farmers filled the higher terraces, murmuring prayers for their city's victory. Some wore charms carved with the glyph of the hero twins, hoping to draw their favour. The energy was not of sport, but of worship. The electric silence before the outcome of fate itself. Priests moved among the crowd, burning copal incense that rose in pale spirals toward the sky. The scent was said to please the gods and guide the souls of players should they die in service to the sun. Meanwhile, drums thundered from temple platforms, their rhythm mimicking the heart of the world. The sound merged with the sharp crack of the rubber ball, creating a pulse that resonated through the plaza like an ancient heartbeat. Betting was common, not with coins, but with honour. A noble might wager his status, a farmer his harvest, believing that fortune itself obeyed divine justice. Yet beneath the human excitement lay a solemn understanding. This was not entertainment. It was devotion in motion. When a point was scored, the crowd erupted in shouts and the blowing of conch shells. But between plays, silence returned quickly, an almost reverent hush. For the Maya, noise was a language the gods could misinterpret. Only the game spoke clearly. As the sun climbed higher, shadows retreated from the stone walls, symbolizing the triumph of light. The spectators lifted their faces to the sky, eyes filled with awe. For in that moment, watching flesh and spirit merge upon the court, they were not merely witnesses, they were participants in the eternal conversation between humanity and the divine. When the final echo of the rubber ball faded into the jungle, the air grew heavy with anticipation. The game's outcome was never just victory or defeat, it was a judgment. The Maya believed that the gods decided which side would live and which would die, and their verdict was delivered through the ball's final bounce. The winners were honoured as heroes, but their reward was not always freedom. In many cities, triumph came with the greatest price: sacrifice. The chosen player, the most skilled, the most noble, the most favoured by the gods, would be adorned in feathers, jade, and gold. His face was painted blue, the colour of divinity and the heavens. The crowd fell silent as priests guided him to the altar beside the court, where obsidian blades gleamed in the sunlight. There, he would offer his beating heart to the gods, ensuring the sun's rebirth and the cycle's continuation. To die in this way was considered the highest honour, a passage to join the hero twins in the celestial afterlife. In other versions of the ritual, the losers bore the burden of death, symbols of the defeated forces of darkness. Their blood was believed to nourish the earth, ensuring rain, crops, and fertility. Either way, the meaning was clear. The universe demanded payment for balance. Victory and death were two sides of the same sacred coin. After the sacrifice, the priests painted the court with fresh blood, tracing symbols of renewal, serpents, maize, and suns. The smell of copal incense thickened the air, mingling with the iron tang of sacrifice. Drums beat softly, not in celebration, but in solemn rhythm, as if echoing the heartbeat that had just ceased. The people bowed their heads, not in mourning, but in reverence. The fallen player's name would be remembered, his deeds carved into stone reliefs along the court walls. His spirit, it was believed, rose with the dawn, guiding the sun through its perilous path across the heavens. His death was not an end, but a transformation, the final play in the cosmic game. When the crowd dispersed and silence returned, the court stood empty once more, a sacred threshold awaiting the next duel between light and shadow, life and sacrifice, victory and eternity. Centuries after the last match was played, the courts of Pok-ta-Pok still stand, silent and worn, yet pulsing with memory. The jungle has reclaimed their edges, vines twisting through ancient carvings, but the stone still hums with the echoes of a game that was never truly a game. To walk among these ruins is to step into a world where sport, sacrifice, and the cosmos were one. Archaeologists who uncovered the courts found more than architecture. They found belief carved into limestone. Reliefs at Chichen Itza, Copan, and Uxmal tell the same story. Men striking the ball, serpents spiraling skyward, and heads transforming into flowering vines. These were not depictions of violence, but of renewal, the eternal cycle of death feeding life. Even the very orientation of the courts, aligned with solstices and constellations, shows that every match was a conversation with the heavens. Though the Maya civilization fell, the spirit of the ballgame endured. Among their descendants and across Mesoamerica, echoes of Pok-ta-Pok survived as ulama, a ritual sport still played in parts of Mexico today. The modern players, like their ancestors, strike the rubber ball with their hips and chant before the match begins. Though blood no longer stains the court, the symbolism remains. The body's endurance, the will to face fate, the ancient rhythm of survival. For the Maya, Pok-ta-Pok was never meant to entertain. It was a reminder that the world's balance is fragile, that every sunrise demands sacrifice, and that even the gods must struggle to keep chaos at bay. To them, each bounce of the ball was a heartbeat of the cosmos, each echo a prayer that light would triumph once more. Today, as the jungle whispers through the ruins, it is easy to imagine the sound of the shaman's drum, the strike of the ball, the roar of the crowd. The court becomes alive again in memory, a stage for gods disguised as men. The ancient players may be long gone, but their purpose lingers, to remind humanity that existence itself is a game of cosmic endurance. And in the stillness of those sacred courts, the sun's eternal duel continues, unseen but never forgotten. Before the great Persian Empire stretched across Asia, before Cyrus the Great became a name whispered in legend, the vast grasslands beyond the Caspian Sea belonged to another power, the Massagetæ. Nomads of the steppe, fierce riders and masters of the bow, they lived under open skies and ruled by strength. And among them rose a woman who would defy the might of Persia itself, Tomyris, queen of the Massagetæ. Her people believed the steppe answered only to those who could tame it. Tomyris did more than that. She united it. In a world where power came from the sword, she ruled not by fear but by presence. Her leadership was earned in the saddle and sealed in battle. Those who saw her described her not as regal but relentless, a woman who spoke little and rode harder than any man beside her. Her kingdom lay at the crossroads between empires, north of Persia, east of the Scythians, and across the great Oxus River. It was a land of endless motion, of horse herds, shifting alliances, and swift revenge. For years, the Massagetæ had remained untamed, their independence preserved by the vastness of the steppe. But now, that freedom faced a threat from the south, the iron ambition of Cyrus the Great. Cyrus had already conquered the Medes, the Babylonians, and the Lydians. His empire stretched from Anatolia to the Indus, but there was one frontier he had yet to subdue, the lands of the nomads. Tomyris watched from afar as his armies advanced, devouring everything in their path. When his messengers came bearing offers of alliance and marriage, thinly veiled demands for submission, she saw them for what they were, the opening move of conquest. The Steppe Queen's answer was sharp as steel. She refused the proposal, sending word to Cyrus that if he wished to meet her, it would not be in marriage, but in battle. In that moment, the fate of two worlds collided, the settled empire of the Persians and the free riders of the north. And Tomyris, with the wind at her back and vengeance in her heart, prepared to show the greatest king on earth what it meant to challenge a queen of the steppe. Cyrus the Great had never faced a woman like Tomyris. To him, the steppe tribes were wild, disorganized, and destined to kneel before Persia's civilization. Yet every scout he sent north returned with the same tale. The Massagetae were not afraid. They fought like wolves, vanishing into the grasslands and reappearing with sudden, brutal precision. Their arrows struck before the enemy saw their faces, and their horses moved as if born from the wind itself. Tomyris watched his army approach the Oxus River, the natural border of her world. She understood what was coming. The Persians would cross, pretending diplomacy while preparing conquest. To Cyrus, she sent a final warning. "Withdraw, or I will give you your fill of blood." But the great king, confident in his destiny, dismissed her as another barbarian queen whose pride would crumble beneath Persian iron. He ordered the construction of pontoon bridges to cross the Oxus. Tomyris, unwilling to let him choose the battlefield, pulled her forces deeper into the plains, waiting for the perfect moment. Her son, Spargapices, led one of her divisions, a brave and fiery warrior who carried his mother's pride and his people's future on his shoulders. Cyrus's plan was cunning. He left behind a lavish camp filled with wine, food, and gold, knowing the steppe tribes had little experience with strong drink. When a detachment of Massagetae, led by Spargapices, discovered the camp, they raided it, and the wine did its work. The Persians returned in the night, slaughtering the drunken warriors and capturing the prince alive. When Tomyris learned her son had been taken, her rage was boundless. She sent a message to Cyrus that thundered across the steppes. "You have taken my son with deceit, not bravery. Restore him to me and I will forgive you. If not, I swear by the sun, lord of my people, I will quench your thirst for blood myself." Cyrus ignored her. Spargapices, ashamed at his capture, took his own life in Persian custody. His death sealed the fate of an empire. Tomyris's sorrow hardened into vengeance. The queen, who once ruled to protect her people, now rode for retribution, and the greatest army on earth was about to meet the fury of the steppe. Grief transformed Tomyris from queen to avenger. Her son's death, a betrayal disguised as strategy, ignited a fury the steppe had never seen. For the Massagetae, vengeance was not a word but a sacred duty, and Tomyris carried it like a torch in the dark. She summoned her tribes from every corner of the plains, horse archers, spearmen, chieftains, and scouts, and forged them into a single, living storm. The wind itself seemed to howl her name. Cyrus believed victory was inevitable. His generals spoke of swift conquest, of scattering the nomads before Persian discipline. But he underestimated the enemy's greatest weapon, the steppe itself. Tomyris knew every ridge, every river crossing, every patch of tall grass that could conceal an ambush. Her scouts moved like ghosts, cutting off supplies, harassing outposts, and leaving no rest for the invaders. Before riding to war, she performed the rites of vengeance. She poured milk and wine upon the ground to honour her ancestors, then lifted her sword to the sky, swearing by the sun god that Cyrus would drown in the blood he so thirsted for. To her people she said, "We fight not for conquest, but for justice. Let no one leave the field until the Persians have learned the price of deceit." When her army gathered, it stretched across the horizon. Thousands of riders armed with composite bows, bronze axes, and an unbreakable will. They painted their faces in crimson and ash, symbols of death and rebirth, and tied eagle feathers in their hair to invoke the spirits of the sky. Cyrus, realizing diplomacy had failed, prepared for the inevitable clash. He arranged his troops in disciplined ranks, heavy infantry, archers, and cavalry drawn from across his empire. But against Tomyris's mobility and ferocity, order would soon become chaos. As dawn broke over the plains, the steppe queen led her warriors forward, her voice rising above the thunder of hooves. The ground trembled beneath the charge, dust swirling like storm clouds. The Persians stood waiting, confident, unmoved, unaware that the battle approaching them was not just for land or pride, but for a mother's vengeance. And in the distance, under a rising sun, Tomyris whispered her son's name, promising that his death would not go unanswered. Cyrus the Great, master of empire and deception, believed he held every advantage. He commanded veterans who had crushed the Medes, conquered Lydia and toppled Babylon. His banners had never known defeat. But in the open grasslands of Central Asia, his strategy turned against him. Tomyris knew the terrain like a second skin, and her patience was as deadly as her blade. For weeks, she let Cyrus believe he was in control. His scouts found abandoned camps, empty trails, and faint hoofprints that vanished into the horizon. The Persians marched deeper into the plains, their lines stretching thinner each day, their supply wagons struggling under the heat. Tomyris shadowed them, unseen, unheard, until the moment was right. Cyrus established camp near a riverbank, confident the nomads would attack recklessly. But Tomyris was no fool. Her warriors struck at dawn, when the mist still hugged the earth. Arrows darkened the sky before the Persians even raised their shields. The Masajte charged like a living storm, their horsemen circling the Persian flanks in perfect unison. Spears shattered, horses screamed, and the once ordered ranks of Cyrus's army dissolved into chaos. The Persians fought valiantly, but the battlefield was not their home. They were soldiers of cities and walls. Tomyris's people were born of the wild, their endurance unmatched. The queen herself rode at the front, her armour gleaming with sunlight, her bow unerring. Those who survived swore they saw her like a vision, golden hair whipping in the wind, her eyes cold as steel, her war cry echoing across the plains. When the dust settled, the Persian camp was drenched in blood. Thousands of Cyrus's men lay dead, their banners trampled beneath hooves. The great king himself, the man who had conquered half the known world, was nowhere to be found. Tomyris searched the battlefield until she found his fallen body among the corpses. He had fought bravely, but the gods had already decided his fate. She ordered his head severed, placed it in a skin filled with blood, and spoke the words that would echo through history. "Drink your fill of blood, as you always thirsted for it." The steppe had claimed an empire, and the queen's vengeance was complete. When the sun rose over the battlefield, the wind carried only silence, the silence of thousands who would never rise again. The once invincible Persian army, conqueror of nations and destroyer of kingdoms, lay broken beneath the hooves of Tomyris's riders. In the chaos and smoke, the great King Cyrus had met the end he had long defied. The man who had united the Persians, Medes, and Babylonians was now just another body among the fallen, his crimson cloak stained with the dust of the steppe. Cyrus's death shocked the ancient world. No foe before had managed to halt his conquests, let alone destroy his army. But Tomyris had not only defeated him, she had humiliated him. Her vengeance had been both personal and cosmic, a rebalancing of the scales after deceit and death. She took no pleasure in it, only justice. To her, Cyrus's fall was not a triumph of pride, but a restoration of honour. The queen stood over his body as the morning light touched the plain. The Persians had brought gold, silk, and banners bearing the symbols of empire, all now meaningless trinkets. She gave orders for the burial of the fallen, both Persian and Masajte. Her people did not gloat. They believed the spirits of the dead, even enemies, demanded respect. Yet the final act of vengeance remained, and Tomyris made sure the world would remember it. She commanded that Cyrus's severed head, be placed in a wineskin filled with human blood. When it was brought before her, she spoke to it as if he could still hear. "Had you lived, I would have shown you mercy. But your thirst for conquest was never sated. Now drink your fill, and let the gods judge you." Word of her deed spread quickly, carried by merchants, prisoners, and survivors who fled across the empire. In Persia, they called it tragedy. In the steppes, they called it justice. The great king, who thought himself chosen by the heavens, had fallen to a queen who ruled by her own strength. And in that moment, the steppe, untamed and eternal, had reminded the world that no empire, no matter how vast, could conquer the wind or the will of a mother avenging her son. In the aftermath of the battle, the world trembled with disbelief. The mightiest conqueror of the age had been destroyed not by another empire, but by a queen of the steppes, a woman whose people lived without cities, thrones, or walls. Tomyris's victory shattered the illusion of Persian invincibility. She had proven that freedom, born from the vast grasslands and the endless sky, could stand against the discipline of empire. The Persians, stunned and leaderless, withdrew from the north. The survivors carried with them the tale of their defeat, a tale so haunting that even centuries later it reached the ears of Herodotus, who immortalized her name. To the Greeks, she became a symbol of barbarian courage, a queen who rose from the wilderness to humble civilization itself. But to her people, she was more than legend. She was justice made flesh. Tomyris ordered the burial of her son, Spargapices, in a place of honor, beneath an open sky where the wind could forever sing his name. She built no monuments, no palaces. Her legacy was not carved in stone but carried in story, retold around campfires and passed from rider to rider across the steppes. Her vengeance had not only avenged her child, but preserved her people's freedom for generations to come. Diplomats and envoys later came from distant lands, offering tribute or seeking alliances. Some sought to test her again, but none dared to invade. The Massage Tay under Tomyris became the guardians of the northern frontier, a people feared for their ferocity and respected for their queen's unshakable resolve. Even in old age, Tomyris remained a figure of awe. The younger warriors of the tribe would whisper her name with reverence, saying she had the strength of 10 men and the wisdom of the gods. She rode until her final years, her bow always close, her eyes still sharp as the edge of a blade. In her lifetime, empires rose and fell, but none dared to challenge her again. She had killed a king and silenced an empire, yet her story was not one of conquest. It was one of defiance. Tomyris had proven that courage needs no crown, and that even the greatest kings must one day bow before the fury of a mother's love. News of Tomyris's triumph spread far beyond the steppes. Traders from Bactria carried the tale down the Silk Road, while Persian exiles whispered it in Babylon and Sardis. To some, it was a cautionary story, that even the greatest ruler can fall through pride. To others, it was a hymn to vengeance, proof that justice could strike even the mightiest. Wherever it travelled, the name Tomyris became synonymous with defiance, and her legend grew with every retelling. In Greece, the historian Herodotus recorded her deeds with awe. He described her as a queen, more courageous than any man of her time, the woman who avenged her son by drowning the great king in blood. To the Hellenic mind, she was the living embodiment of Nemesis, divine retribution sent to humble a conqueror who thought himself beyond fate. Poets turned her into myth, painting her as a goddess of war riding beneath an endless sky, her arrows tipped with justice. In Persia, however, her name became a wound. Cyrus had been the founder of their empire, a man regarded as nearly divine. To admit his defeat was to question destiny itself. The Persian scribes softened the story. Some claimed he died in another campaign, others that his soul ascended peacefully to the heavens. But among the soldiers who had survived that bloody day, there was no forgetting the truth. They spoke of the queen who struck from the north like a thunderstorm and left no empire untouched. Across Central Asia, Tomyris became a guardian spirit of the steppes. Nomads told their children that she rode with the wind, watching over the free peoples of the plains. Warriors prayed to her before battle, asking for her ferocity and her unbending heart. Even centuries later, when new conquerors arose, Alexander, Genghis Khan, Tamerlane, her legend lingered, a whisper of warning to those who sought to rule the world by force. Tomyris was no longer just a woman or a queen. She was the spirit of resistance itself. Her story transcended time, surviving in songs, carvings, and memory. And as her legend spread, one truth remained constant. Kingdoms fade, empires crumble, but the echo of courage never dies. Long after her death, Tomyris became more than a memory. She became the spirit of the steppe itself. Her people, the Masajte, continued to live as they always had, free, fierce, and loyal only to the open sky. But her legend outlived her tribe, echoing through generations of nomads who crossed those same windswept plains. Every queen who took up the bow, every warrior who rode into battle against tyranny, carried a fragment of Tomyris within them. No monuments were built in her name, no marble statues carved to preserve her likeness. Yet her story endured in a way stone never could, passed in songs, campfire tales, and the breath of storytellers who rode from village to village. In the dark nights of the steppe, when the stars burned bright and the wolves howled across the plains, the old women would tell the children how the queen who lost her son took vengeance on the world's greatest king. Over time, her legend blended with myth. Some said she was taken by the gods after her victory, lifted into the heavens as a guardian of the sun. Others claimed her spirit still rode the steppe winds, appearing in storms to warn those who sought to enslave her people. Persian chroniclers tried to erase her, Greek historians immortalized her, and Central Asian poets turned her into a symbol, not of vengeance alone, but of freedom that can never be conquered. For centuries, empires rose and fell on the same soil where she once rode. The Achaemenids gave way to the Parthians to the Mongols, and the Mongols to the Timurids, each one believing themselves eternal. Yet, in the heart of every conqueror who crossed the steppe, there lingered an unease, a whisper on the wind that carried her name. Tomyris. She was a queen who ruled without a throne, fought without fear, and died without defeat. Her vengeance may have begun with blood, but her legacy lived through courage. As long as the steppe stretched beneath the endless sky, the tale of the woman who defied an empire would never fade. The Persians built monuments. Tomyris became one. Millennia have passed since Tomyris rode across the steppes, but her story refuses to fade. History, written mostly by men and kings, tried to bury her beneath the dust of time. Yet her name endures like a heartbeat beneath the soil. Every empire that came after Persia carried her memory as both a warning and a myth. Beware the wrath of a woman wronged, and never mistake patience for weakness. To the Persians, she became a scar upon their legacy, a reminder that even the great Cyrus, favoured by the gods, was mortal. To the Greeks, she was a tale of poetic justice, a queen who embodied nemesis, divine retribution. To the nomads of Central Asia, she was something greater, a guardian spirit, the eternal mother of the steppes who defended her people from the greed of kings. Her image lived on not in temples or scrolls, but in the wind, the horse's stride, and the whisper of the plains at night. As centuries turned, her legend crossed borders and tongues. The Scythians claimed her as their own. The Kazakhs and Turkmen sang of her valour in their epic poems. Even medieval chroniclers in distant lands wrote of a queen who killed the mightiest ruler of the East. She transcended history to become a symbol, not just of vengeance, but of freedom, dignity, and the defiance of empire. Modern historians still debate the truth of her story. Was it legend shaped by awe, or history preserved by courage? Yet even if the details blurred, the spirit remained clear. Tomyris stood for those who refused to bow, those who would rather die on their own soil than live as subjects. Her story outlived the cities of her enemies, the empires that rose and fell, and the monuments that crumbled to dust. In the end, her legacy is not written in stone or bronze, but in the idea she represents, that power does not belong only to kings and conquerors. It can rise from the wild, from the free, from the heart of a mother who rides into battle to avenge her blood. And as long as there are voices to tell her tale, Tomyris, queen, warrior, avenger, will never truly die.